Story 1. A very good friend of mine and myself, back in our high school days, decided we wanted to be ghost hunters. We had a few creepy stories come out of our hunting. Whether they were from nerves or they actually happened doesn't matter. We were sufficiently freaked out. Of note is the haunted farmhouse that was a well-known spot near our town. We hadn't heard of any murders or anything at the old farmhouse, but it was talked about often in my school. My friend had even visited once before. He told me the story of his first daytime visit. He and some of his other friends went to the farmhouse to investigate, as high school delinquents do. They entered the house and decided that they would take some wallpaper as proof that they were brave enough to do so. Only one of the group of 4 decided not to grab some wallpaper, and the next day the 3 that did all broke out in a strange rash. Once we decided that this would be the perfect spot to explore. We got our hands on a video camera and went to do our preliminary check during the daytime, so that we could get a good idea of the layout of the old abandoned farm. The entire place was definitely creepy, but only in a rundown sort of way. We walked past the house and out into the field toward a trailer in the middle of the field to start our search at the furthest point. We were going to make our way back through all of the farm buildings and finish our daytime search in the farmhouse itself. We filmed the trailer and then began walking back toward the farmhouse. We were walking far enough away from each other and at an extreme enough angle that we couldn't see or hear what each other was doing unless we made a rather loud noise. It was at this time that we heard a terrified scream from the direction of the trailer, but much further away. We both turned to see what it was and then looked at each other, realizing that neither of us had imagined it and in fact had both heard it. We decided to continue on, thinking that maybe it was some sort of bird or something. We neared the back of the house and filmed it. We could hear a slight metal on metal scraping noise coming from within the house. It was creepy, to be sure, but this was a very old building. We explored the rest of the dilapidated farm, finding nothing of interest. Then we worked up the courage to explore the house. It was incredibly creepy inside, but we forced ourselves to continue. We found nothing but empty rooms inside and decided we needed to explore the attic. We went up into the attic. He had the camera, so he went first to get a first-hand view. There was nothing up there, but as soon as we settled in looking around in it, we both heard a sound that gave us chills. We heard it at the same instant, but we heard different sounds. I heard a young child softly say, "Help me." He heard the chimes of a clock. He looked at me with the camera and said, "Did you hear that?" I instructed to make sure that the camera was recording. He affirmed that the record light was on, and the camera was counting the time it was recording. We were freaked out and did not want to stay any longer, so we left. As we were leaving and said into the camera, "Okay, we are leaving the property now." Once we were in his truck and safely away from the farm, I reviewed the tape. The problem was, from the moment we heard the metal on metal scraping, which was recorded on tape, to the moment he said his parting phrase into the camera, was simply missing. It wasn't scrambled or blank, it just didn't exist. It was as if all of the intervening footage was edited out. We went back for our nighttime investigation about a week later, with my little brother. As we approached the property, we could sense something very dark and terrifying on the property. The farm seemed to be darker than the surrounding area, as if it was absorbing light. We could not bring ourselves to enter the property. We all froze and had to just stare for a few minutes. We decided that we shouldn't enter and left. Once we got back toward our town, my little brother spoke. I didn't want to say anything while we were there, but as we were driving away, I saw a little kid's face, pale white, staring at us from inside the house. My friend divulged that he had seen the same thing before he got into the vehicle, but didn't want to set us into a panic. The rest of the story comes from my friend, so I cannot speak to the truthfulness of this part. A few weeks later, he had just broken up with a girl he deeply cared for. It was a Saturday night, and he needed to be alone. He decided to go to the farmhouse by himself. I have no idea what he was thinking. He said he was so pissed off that he just didn't care and went into the farmhouse. He started to climb into the attic to sit down. Minutes later, he called me. He was panicking and out of breath. He told me that something pale had screeched at him and chased him out of the attic and off of the property. We never went back to the property again. Story 2. My family has a farm that's been ours for 13 generations. The new house on the property was built in 1906. My dad grew up there with all of his siblings, his parents, his father's parents, and his mother's mother. It's a big house, and the rooms are quite large, but there are only 4 bedrooms, so it was always close quarters for everyone. Some of the family, for generations, would sleep on the sleeping porch, which was just a screened-in part of the wraparound porch with a door that led to one of the bedrooms. My dad always slept in a room with his only brother and 3 of his sisters. His 2 oldest sisters are twins, and they got a big room downstairs all to themselves. They still think of it as theirs, even though they hadn't stayed in it for over 40 years. My parents lived in a different city when I decided to move into the farmhouse to go to college here. Everyone seemed happy with the idea. The only person living in the house at the time was my grandmother. My uncle, who worked the farm, would go home every night and refuse to sleep in the farmhouse. I was going to help take care of my grandmother during the nights and mornings in exchange for staying there rent-free, a trade-off I was more than happy with. Since there are only 2 bedrooms on the ground floor, and the upstairs bedrooms aren't connected to the air conditioning, I got to stay in the big front bedroom. We never use the front door at the farmhouse anymore, but the front bedroom is right off the entrance to the house. It's pretty secluded from the rest of the house and bedrooms. Originally, it was the master bedroom and has a little butler's pantry that connects it to what used to be the dining room as well. It has one real door coming off the front room, but it's blocked by a big wardrobe. The door through the pantry is about 5 feet tall, but it is the only door we use to get into that room now. It's also the only bedroom with a fireplace, but I don't think anyone has used it in decades. The room was already very full of things. There was the large wardrobe blocking the real door, a massive 4-poster bed, 2 bedside tables whose drawers were pre-filled with decades of junk, another smaller wardrobe filled with gowns for a teenager, a large dresser pushed to one side, a small dressing table and chair, covered over with fancy hats, purses, and an odd assortment of antique perfume bottles, some still with liquid inside, a coffee table, and the most uncomfortable sofa that has ever existed. One whole wall is full of shelves with knickknacks piled as deep as possible. The closet was stuffed to the brim, and the bathroom that was added off the side in the 90s was already filled to with an almost unconscionable amount of hair products, medicine, and bathrobes. Even the dresser sitting against the wall was stuffed with old clothes that no one could wear anymore, but that couldn't be given or thrown away. My aunts graciously cleaned out a single drawer for me to use. I didn't mind. As a broke college student, I was just happy to have a place to stay. I eventually cleared out a small space in the closet and got in the habit of hanging most of my clothes. At first, everything went very well for me. After 2 weeks, I was already on edge. I started having some pretty extreme nightmares. It started off simple. I would wake up and see the bathroom light was on, so I'd get up and turn it off. No big deal. I would then wake up again a few seconds later and realize the light was still on. Okay, I must have dreamed I turned it off. I will just get up again. This happened over and over. It must have been hours of this endless loop. While it was happening, I remember being unnerved, but I never thought to just leave it on or to try and wake up all the way. Finally, my alarm to get up would go off and I would struggle out of bed, sore as though I really had gotten up hundreds of times that night, and exhausted. I would never have to turn the bathroom light on in the mornings. It was always on when I woke. I was exhausted all of the time, but somehow managed to keep up with school and with my duties at the house. I would make breakfast every morning, do the laundry, clean the kitchen, go to school, get groceries, come back, make dinner, clean, and then retire to that room. The crazy light switch dreams never stopped, but scarier dreams started peppering my nights. I would be lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when someone would get into bed next to me. The first time I assumed it was my little sister. She was 24, not that little, because she would do that sometimes when she finished working outside. Did I mention she and one of my cousins help run the farm? She normally just stays on the outside edge and falls asleep fast, but today she got right next to me. She was so hot, I asked her to move, so she rolled over onto my chest. I couldn't breathe. I opened my eyes and saw it was very much not my sister. It was humanoid, all right, but it was dark red, like old blood. It lay on top of me and refused to move. I struggled as much as I could, which wasn't much. The creature on top of me must have weighed 300 pounds. I was suffocating. My vision was going black and I tried to scream. Nothing came out of my flattened lungs. My mind went blank and I suddenly started to calm down and lose control of my muscles. I accepted that I was dying. I wasn't fighting anymore, just waiting for the end. Then the light in the room shifted. It was as if a bright light had come on from the empty wall. Strange, unfamiliar shadows played across the ceiling. As the light snapped off, the weight disappeared and air exploded painfully into my lungs. My vision returned to normal slowly, and I laid there, gasping. Oddly, this whole experience didn't faze me at all. Not the first time or the dozens of other times after that. I would always look around the room, get up and turn off the bathroom light, then come back to bed and fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Thinking back now, I don't know how I managed to fall asleep, as these nightmares keep me up at night a decade later. About 5 months into my stay at the farmhouse, I had an extremely vivid nightmare. In the dream, I woke up and heard my grandmother scream. I hopped out of bed and ran to her room, only to find a puddle of blood in her place. I reached out to touch it and felt the floor start to give way underneath me. I looked down and I was standing knee-deep in bubbling, bright red blood. It was warm and thicker than I would have thought. I tried to step out of it, but only sank deeper. I struggled to grab onto anything in the room, the bed, the side table, the floor. But everything I touched started to bubble up. I screamed as I sank deeper and deeper. The crushing weight of the blood compacted my chest and made it hard to breathe. I tried to keep my head above the blood to no avail. It filled my nose and mouth. It was warm, thick, and oddly sweet. I choked but couldn't take a breath. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears, and my face and chest got very hot. Soon, my body wouldn't let me hold my breath anymore and forced the blood deep into my lungs, filling me with a sharp and intense pain. I was dropped with a jarring crack onto the front bedroom floor. I retched and coughed up blood. I couldn't clear my airway or my lungs, but I kept trying. I struggled to get up and run out of the house. I tried to run to the back door, but the hallway melted underneath me again. I fought against the bubbling blood, trying to swim. It was already hard to breathe, and this time when I went under, I didn't last long before getting another lungful of the foul blood. Still, I tried again and again. I refused to die this way. Every room and every door was blocked. I couldn't get out of the house. On my last attempt, coughing and shaking, I stood up and screamed. It was a short and pathetic scream, and it brought on another fit of body-racking coughs, but I kept screaming. I wiped blood from my eyes and grabbed the large wardrobe blocking the door in the bedroom. My fingers were wet with blood, but the tackiness of the semi-dried stuff helped my game purchase on the sides. I was able to move it just far enough out of the way to squeeze through the door. I scraped my hips and arm badly trying to get through, but I managed it. I left the house through the front door and breathed in the night air. I was so relieved that I sat down hard on the front porch and laughed. Suddenly, as if my laughing had jarred me awake, I woke up in bed. I was still laughing, and my hip and arm ached, but the wardrobe was still in place, and there was no trace of blood anywhere. I did get a nasty bruise on my arm, but it faded pretty quickly. The crushing red creature returned, and the bathroom light tick recurred quite often, but I honestly started getting used to them. The puddles of blood never came back, which was a great relief. I had plenty of run-of-the-mill nightmares too, being chased through the farmhouse by a murderer, dead children coming and filling the house screaming at me to leave, a woman standing beside my bed shouting in a foreign language so I couldn't rest, my great-great-grandmother whose room this had used to be standing and staring at me ominously. These were all less real feelings, and I could easily write them off as stress nightmares. The thing that finally drove me out of the farmhouse was the death of my uncle. He came to the farm one day and ate breakfast as normal. My twin aunts happened to be staying at the time. If they stayed, I either slept on the couch or upstairs. Anytime they stayed over, they demanded the front room. I hated it, because things of mine would always go missing. They've thrown away a dozen toothbrushes and deodorants at this point in my stay at the farmhouse, not to mention some of my clothes and even a pair of shoes. That morning, I left for school as normal but got a call after my first class. My uncle had apparently grabbed his chest and started shouting as soon as he left the farmhouse that morning. They rushed him to the ER, but it was too late. He'd had a massive heart attack. I wasn't too broken up. The man was less than nice to me, but a lot of my family were crushed. His funeral was 3 days later, and my poor father could barely make it through a sentence without his voice breaking and a sob escaping. I became the shoulder to cry on for a lot of people because I was so composed. More than one person told me how devastated I must be that he was gone, especially since we'd grown so close over the last 7 months. I played along as best I could, but was secretly glad he was gone. I knew I wasn't the only one that felt that way. But late at night on the day of the funeral, I was getting ready to go to bed. My twin aunts were sitting in the kitchen and must have thought I had long since gone to sleep. They had their heads together and were giggling and working on some weird craft project. It looked a little too much like a voodoo doll, but I never got a good look. I tried backing away, but the older one looked up at me. "Oh, I didn't realize you were awake. Are we keeping you up?" I replied, "No, just get some water before I go to bed." They said goodnight and I slunk back upstairs, feeling their eyes on me the whole time. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I don't know why, but that was the final straw for me. My aunts moved back into the farmhouse in the front bedroom, and I moved out into the smallest, cheapest apartment I could find. It was a struggle getting by while still in school, but I didn't have any nightmares after I left that house. Story 3. Let me start off by saying that I was a Boy Scout for 10 years. I started when I was 7, earned my Eagle Scout badge, stayed in until I aged out, so I spent a lot of time in the woods. I love the woods. It's where I feel comfortable. Being out in the wilderness rejuvenates me, but I'll be the first to admit that at night, the woods are creepy. You can't see anything outside of the campfire light, you can only hear, and you can't always tell what it is you're hearing. There were lots of nights I laid in my tent and heard sounds outside with no idea what they were. It was probably just a raccoon or a squirrel, but I was usually too scared to look. In all my years, though, I only had one truly frightening experience on a camping trip, and it was in broad daylight. This happened to me when I was 17 years old, 7 years ago. I was on a week-long scout trip at a place called Big South Fork up in the Cumberland region on the Tennessee-Kentucky state line. We spent the first half of the week backpacking up in the hills, and the second half was spent taking it easy at base camp. This happened on our last day on the trail. We had finished eating breakfast and we were ready to break camp and head out. Our campsite was at a place called the Littenslaven Farm. We camped in a patch of woods in a little valley where they had once had a cattle pasture. At the top of the valley was a small shed, a spring-fed pond, and the old farmhouse. It wasn't a big house. It was a wooden house with 2 rooms on the first floor and a loft on the second floor. I would have loved to go inside and check it out, but nobody was allowed inside so it would be easier to preserve. Anyway, after breakfast I realized that I had left my walking stick up at the top of the hill by the old house. I went back to get it, and my friend, Chris, went with me. Rule number 1, always take a buddy. We hiked up the hill and I got my stick. Then we made the hike back down to camp. We were halfway across the pasture when something told me to look back. I looked behind me and saw someone in the upstairs window waving at me. It looked like a woman dressed in white, but I glanced so quickly it was hard to make out the details. I turned to Chris and plainly said, "There's someone in the farmhouse." What follows is my thought process that occurred in the space of about half a second. There's someone in the farmhouse. There's nobody else here. Nobody is even allowed in the farmhouse. There's someone in the farmhouse. Sheet. There's someone in the farmhouse, I screamed. I took off running as fast as I could. Chris had no idea what was going on and ran with me. We didn't stop until we got back to camp. I told the others what I had seen. "You should have gone in," said our scoutmaster, Chris's dad. "She probably had breakfast ready." Real funny. We got back to base camp and told everybody else what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe me. That was completely understandable. I'm a bit of a skeptic, and I was halfway convinced that it was a park ranger or just a glare on the glass. But I'm also naturally curious, and it just kept nagging at me. Who was it? What was it? Why was it? A person? A ghost? I had to know. That night, curiosity got the better of me. Chris and I were in our tent, about to bed down for the night. "Chris, did you see that person in the farmhouse this morning?" I asked. "No," he answered, "but I saw you running, so I started running." "I know I saw something. I swear it looked like a woman waving at me." "Okay. And that doesn't seem the least bit interesting to you?" "I guess a little bit." "Let's go back and check out that house." "We can't just leave camp." "Well then let's go right now while everyone is asleep. We'll be back before anyone knows we're gone." "You're crazy," he said. "Come on," I responded. "A scout is brave, right?" He sighed. "Fine, let's go." In hindsight, what we did next was really stupid. Even with a buddy, you should never wander off into the woods at night, especially if you don't tell someone at base camp. But we were young and dumb and adventurous. So we grabbed our flashlights, put on our boots, and hit the trail. The farmhouse was only 3 miles from base camp, so it didn't take us long to get there. We went inside and didn't see anything of interest. The first story had dirt floors, and there was nothing inside but a heavy layer of dust on the timber floors of the second story. There was absolutely zero evidence that there had been anybody in that house for a very long time. "Look," I said. "No footprints." "Yeah, no footprints," he replied. "Nobody was here. Or it was a ghost. Cut that out, man." "Why, does it scare you?" I asked. "Yeah, kinda." "Well, there's nothing here," I said. "Might as well go back to camp." We left the house and set off back to camp. Do you remember how I said it's stupid to wander into the woods at night? What happened next demonstrates this perfectly. We were walking down the trail, and walking down the trail, and walking down the trail. "Shouldn't we be there by now?" I asked. "Yeah," replied Chris. "It feels like it's taking us longer to get back than it took us to get here." I checked my watch. It took less than an hour to get to the farmhouse. Since we had left the farmhouse, we had been walking for 3 hours. "Dude, I think we're lost," I said. "Looks like it." I sat down on the ground to rest and to think about what we needed to do next. I felt something hard and cold under me. "What the heck? What is it?" asked Chris. "I sat on something," I answered as I wiped off the surface. Under the leaves, there was a tombstone. It was small and square and looked old. "Well, that's creepy," said Chris. I read the inscription aloud. "Archie Slavin, April 30th, 1935 through February 19th, 1936. Geez, he was just a baby. Now I'm depressed." Just then, a cold breeze blew down the trail. "Dang, that's cold," I said. "This is getting really weird." The breeze got stronger. I heard something. It was clear and distinct and sounded like a woman. Call me crazy, but I know I heard a voice say, "My baby." The weird thing about it was that I couldn't tell if someone actually said it, or if it was just in my head. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" he asked. "Someone said my baby." I thought I just imagined it. Man, let's get out of here." We followed the trail back the way we came and made it back to camp just before dawn. We didn't tell anyone about our late-night journey. The day went by uneventfully. We played games, built fires, tied knots. You know, scout stuff. That night, a park ranger was making his rounds through the campgrounds. Before he left, Chris and I decided we needed to ask him a few questions. "What can I do for you boys?" asked the ranger. "Well," I started. "We were wondering if you could tell us about the Litton Slavin farmhouse. It's an old farmhouse, almost 100 years old," he answered. "Matter of fact, it belonged to the family that used to own a lot of the land in the park." "Is there anything else?" asked Chris. "Like what? Is there anything unusual about it?" The park ranger smiled. "You boys met Miss Marjorie." "Who is she?" The ranger cleared his throat and told us the tale. The Littons started the farm way back in the 1800s. The farm was passed down from generation to generation and eventually went to James Slavin. James passed it down to his son, Jim. Jim married Marjorie and they had a little baby boy. "Archie," I exclaimed. "Yeah," said the ranger, "Archie. Well, when Archie was just a baby, he was carried off into the mountains by a wolf." "That's terrible," said Chris. "It gets worse," said the ranger. "The body was never found. They searched for weeks. Jim combed over every inch of those hills and couldn't find anything. Miss Marjorie went mad with grief. Even when the search was abandoned, she insisted that her son was still alive. And then one day, while Jim was out in the pasture tending to the cows, Marjorie hung herself from the rafters. She left a note that said, "I'm going to find my baby." After that, Jim couldn't take it anymore and he sold the farm to the state. He buried his wife at the church cemetery and put a monument for his son on a hillside overlooking the valley. Chris and I were silent. The ranger continued. "Miss Marjorie shows herself every now and then, just the way you described it. She stands in the upstairs window and waves, but you can't go in the house." Chris and I looked at each other. "Why not?" I asked. The ranger smirked and said, "You boys went in the house, didn't you?" I nodded. The ranger chuckled as he told us, "Well, boys, you took her up in the invitation. Now you're part of the search party, and she'll never let you forget it." We didn't understand what he meant, and he left before we could ask him. But that night, we figured it out. All night long, Chris and I both heard the whisper, My baby. 7 years have passed. I don't hear the whisper as often. It went from constant to once or twice a day, then less and less often. Some days I think Miss Marjorie forgot about me, but every few months she reminds me what I'm supposed to be looking for. My baby.